So I thought I would start with an appropriate question at a company like LinkedIn. I thought I would ask you all to close your eyes for a second and picture your very first job. So I'm guessing these were probably the days before LinkedIn. And I'm guessing that your very first job wasn't very glamorous. You can open your eyes now. My personal job was as a secretary in a downtown LA law firm, which was the summer after my sophomore year in high school. And this was the era of sweater sets and little cute pumps, and I felt very cool and professional walking in there. And I remember glowing with pride when I received my very first paycheck, which was $1,200 for 2 months of full-time work for a law firm in LA. So probably less than what they paid the janitor. But nonetheless, despite the low wages, the job gave me something that I never had before, which was a sense of my worth in the world. And I'm guessing that for all of you, regardless of what your first job was, that first paycheck gave you a heady sense of self. And it made you independent from your parents. It made you part of a global community of wage earners, and it gave you your first set of professional references. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, I want you to imagine what life would be like in the alternate universe in which you didn't have that first job. Imagine instead that you're one of the 4 billion people who lives on less than $3 a day. And that's adjusted for purchasing power. So that's $3 in 2005 in the US. So living on less than what a Frappuccino cost. And that's the reality for a huge number of people around the world. And in all likelihood, if you had to pick a ticket in the birth lottery today, that's the ticket that you would draw. So you'd be much like Jacqueline, who is a young woman that I met about a month ago on the outskirts of Nairobi. She's from the Machakos district, which is about 2 hours from Kenya's biggest city, Nairobi, by crowded bush bus or matatu. And Jacqueline grew up with a single mom and 3 young sisters. And miraculously, she made it to high school and college by doing odd jobs, which is really rare for a woman in Africa. And then once she got to college, she enrolled in an engineering course, even more rare. But after 2 years, unfortunately, Jacqueline had to quit because she couldn't pay her school fees. And this happens so often in the developing world. People enroll in school, they finally make it, their parents have invested and paid their school fees through high school, and then they end up quitting when they're in college because they can't afford to continue. And unfortunately, this meant that Jacqueline had to move to a slum and rent a room on the outskirts of Nairobi. And her depression was tempered somewhat by this lively landlady who we met there, who let us take pictures of her. She's known for colorful stories and outfits, and let us take this picture after we laughed at several of her jokes. But this was basically, you know, Jacqueline's only thing to look forward to was this great landlady. She didn't have a job, and she had dropped out of school. And she felt completely hopeless. And unfortunately, this is the reality for most of the youth in the developing world. There are about 1 billion young people who will enter the labor force in the next decade and face 50% unemployment. Millions of women like Jacqueline live on the edges of big cities and end up going into the sex trade or getting hired as domestic servants with no legal rights because there's just no formal work opportunities available to them. And a similar number of young men end up joining militia groups as a result of unemployment. The protests in the 2008 Kenyan elections, which you may have heard of, were filled with youth from Kibera and Mathare, which are the 2 largest slums in Kenya, who were paid $1 a day to riot in the streets. Very few people realize that that's what fueled all of these riots. Young men like this one, like Sylvester from the Congo, take up arms for even less than $1 a day. They take up arms just for the guarantee of food and shelter and some kind of security and something to occupy long days filled with nothing else to do. So to us, $1 doesn't seem like much, but when your opportunity cost is 0 because there's no formal work employment or work opportunities, and 70% of the people in your area have no jobs, all of a sudden the rational thing to do becomes to sign up for one of these militia groups and bear arms. And this kind of what we call economic apartheid has really deep implications for young people who want to obtain decent work, because for the most part it just doesn't exist. In Africa, nearly 150 million young people like Jacqueline and like Sylvester don't have work, or they perform menial jobs in the informal sector that don't keep them out of poverty. So their interaction with the global market becomes, at best, as consumers of products like Coca-Cola or Unilever soap, but they have no way to contribute as producers. to a massive subset of humanity, those of us in the rich world have basically said, you can receive our charity, you can receive our handouts, and you can consume what our multinational companies sell, but we're never going to value you as true producers capable of making anything that we'll buy. And that's because the barriers to us seem too great, right? Traditionally, we've held two beliefs. The first is that poor people lack skills to participate fully in the global economy. They don't have enough education. They don't have the skills to join the workforce of around 3 billion people. And the second is that even if they had these skills, there's simply not enough infrastructure where they live to employ them en masse. So I'm going to challenge both of these assumptions today. And I'm going to start with the skills assumption. So we are, in fact, witnessing a tremendous surge in human potential. In the next 30 years, more people will receive a formal education than in all of human history. The great design thinker E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful. How many people have heard of E.F. Schumacher? Anyone here? So E.F. Schumacher said that the greatest challenge in the next century is going to be a global moron shortage. Now, obviously, people who are literate are not morons, but I think he makes a really good point that there's this huge surge in human talent and capability, and there are not enough jobs to absorb all of these new people. And global literacy has really climbed steadily, as you can see, since we began measuring it, fueled in large part due to massive investment by, and funding for free primary education by Western donors. So because of this, 95% of people under 30 in countries like Kenya can read and write. It's really unbelievable. India's most prestigious engineering school, IIT, where my dad actually went, is joining MIT and putting all of their lectures online for free. So we're very close to a time when the best content in the world will be available for free online, and anyone will be able to access it. And what this means is that a growing subset of people living on less than $3 a day have the skills to do much more than manual labor, much more than the informal work that we've relegated them to. But unfortunately, they're largely invisible to employers because they have zero formal work experience. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with that problem because this is a company that deals with that every day. And I'll come back to this point in a couple of minutes. So let's turn to the second point then, which is about infrastructure. Without a doubt, the most successful job creators in recent history were manufacturing plants, developed using assembly line techniques that Henry Ford pioneered in the early part of the last century. And Ford's innovation did something amazing. It took the production of this highly complex machine, the automobile, and it broke it down into small tasks that anybody with a bit of training could do. And in doing this, Ford liberated the auto manufacturing industry from the elite realm of the craftsman studio, and he paved the way for the post-war economic boom in the United States, and I would argue the employment of hundreds of millions of people globally in factories. But you can't build big factories like this in most of the places that poor people live in, right? Because you need ways to bring raw materials in and move the finished product out. You need functional roads and waterways. You need grid power. You need customs officials who aren't going to hold up your order in exchange for a bribe. And to pay for all of this, you usually have to create economies of scale and bring lots of people together at once. And so that's how I used to think about job creation. And that's what made me think that it was impossible to employ lots of poor people in the formal sector at the lowest level, right? But then I stumbled upon a new kind of work that could employ millions of people who are currently living in poverty without making them leave their homes and move into the slums in big cities. And what's fascinating about this new kind of work is that the only infrastructure that you need to make it possible is a brain, a cell phone, a cheap computer, and a signal. The factory of tomorrow, I believe, looks a lot less like this and a lot more like this. In Kenya last year, 1 million internet-enabled devices were sold in a country with about 40 million people that's still largely in poverty. Small computer labs like this one are popping up all over the developing world, and with them, a new kind of opportunity, which we call microwork. Microwork is a concept that we invented 3 years ago to apply Henry Ford's assembly line thinking to the standard outsourcing model. So we thought, what if you could break down large data projects into really small units of work and then train workers to do specific tasks online, just like you could train people to fill specific parts of an assembly line. Through automation and through standardization, you could make it easy to employ people in the farthest corners of the earth, reporting in from centers just like this one, and playing a role in a new virtual kind of assembly line. So this concept can be a little hard to grasp, even for those of you in tech. So I'll give you a concrete example of what we mean by microwork. Every month in the US alone, tens of thousands of businesses, of small businesses, from cafes to shoe repair shops to dry cleaners, are opened, closed, or moved to new locations. And products like Google Maps or any website that has listings information needs accurate data to send users to the right place. Most of the time, the information already exists somewhere on the web, usually on the company's own website. And all that's needed is for a human to go to the Contact Us page, scrape the correct address or phone number, and paste it into some kind of a form. And this is something that anybody, even somebody with low English literacy, can be trained to do. This is not rocket science. And interestingly, it's something that, that scraping programs don't do very well still. So imagine how many countries have this kind of a need. Imagine all of the companies that are getting formed in the developing world every day and moving every day. And imagine all of the companies that are reliant on having accurate data like this. And this isn't the only kind of thing that you can turn into microwork. Western companies currently spend $1.3 trillion on digital services. So this is everything that's encompassed in that term outsourcing, everything from data entry on the very low end to financial services on the very high end. And it also includes things like data entry and image tagging. So you can have micro workers monitor security camera footage and tag it and tell you what's going on in the feed, or key in numbers from a stack of receipts, or transcribe business cards from a mobile app like CardMunch. And they can do it with incredibly cheap technology. You don't need to have them using MacBooks, right? Thanks to Moore's law, the cost of computing devices has gone down so dramatically in the last 5 years. In fact, I just read the other week about this new Linux machine, the Raspberry Pi, which is expected to retail for $25 in the next 2 months. So it doesn't come with a keyboard or a monitor, but those things are pretty cheap, right? So if you attach this to those things and you get this machine online, this is all you need to be able to do that kind of work. The number of computers in the world has now reached over 1 billion, and the price for the average East African to get online will go down by 90% this year, thanks to 2 new fiber optic cables. That's really the last part of Africa to receive fiber optic capacity. And even if you don't have a link to a cable, you can install one of these. This is a satellite dish on the roof of our center in Haiti, which shares space with a family of 6 and their stoves. And what's amazing is the speed at which this kind of connectivity is reaching the poor. 2 billion people are on the internet now, and we're just seeing a huge shift in the nature of who's online. And it's this shift that convinced me to quit my consulting job 3 years ago to found a nonprofit social business called Samasource. The mission of Samasource is to connect poor people to work via the internet to solve poverty. We started with a really bold question. We thought, what if one day we could convince major companies to direct just 1% of what they spend on outsourcing, which is $10 billion, to poor people trained to complete microwork? We could make a dramatic dent on poverty in a really short time. And what's more, we could enable poor people to learn skills for which there is real growing global demand. So I've worked in Africa for more than a decade. I started when I was 16. I actually first went to Africa on a scholarship from a big tobacco company in Maryland, which I got when I was 16. I was still in high school. And I really just wanted to get out of LA, and this was a nice excuse for me to do that. So I took this $10,000 scholarship and went and volunteered at this school for blind kids in Ghana in what would have been the second semester of my senior year of high school. And I noticed then that there was just this incredible human talent that was going to waste. And what really frustrated me were some of the traditional job creation programs that I'd seen implemented by Western donors. I've seen countless attempts by really well-meaning people to train poor people to make cute bead bracelets or these tchotchkes, these Haitian hand mirrors. And I think while these things make us feel better about the problem of poverty, they have a tiny market globally. Right? And like many of you, I've been convinced to buy some of this stuff, and I love participating in ethical handicraft trade. But I want us to think deeply, is this kind of thing really going to end poverty at scale in the long run in the developing world? And I just don't think it is. The entire fair trade industry, and this is not to criticize fair trade. I think it's so much better than anything we had in the past. So it's certainly a step in the right direction. But the entire fair trade industry, including every agricultural product, every handicraft, every beaded bracelet, and everything else that retails under that label of fair trade, is worth $5 billion annually, which is tiny. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the $1.3 trillion that is spent on digital services. So we decided that we would try to make these digital services performed by poor people, this Microwork, saleable to big companies by building a business model around it. And at its core is the Sama Hub, which is our technology platform that trains workers through sample tasks and videos and manages the allocation, distribution, and quality checking of the final work product. So we studied, we really looked hard at all of these crowdsourcing and online work systems. We studied them deeply, and we took the best of the available systems and engineered them specifically for use by lower income but really capable people in the developing world. And what emerged was the Sama Hub. And this is the interface that a worker sees when she logs into our technology system. It's a simple web form. It has instructions and a couple of radio buttons. And a completed task on a system like ours is only worth a couple of cents. So it's not really worth much. But in a day, a worker can earn several dollars. And even though we don't think that's much here, that's 300% or more of what they might earn doing anything else locally. So it's a huge jump in income, even with tasks that don't seem very highly paid here. And I'm proud to share that Samasource has now scaled to over 1,500 workers at over 26 locally owned, what we call delivery centers. So these are former internet cafes and local data and technology centers that we've converted into Microwork centers in the developing world. And they're primarily in East Africa, South Asia, and even in Haiti, in the central plateau of Haiti, where nothing like this has ever existed. Nobody's ever done any kind of data entry in the central plateau. And most of these centers are now independently profitable thanks to the income that they earn from these contracts. So not only have we helped a whole new class of workers learn how to do internet-based work, but we've helped the center entrepreneurs learn how to create viable businesses in places where nobody thought that kind of thing was possible. And another interesting factor in our model is that we have really low attrition. So you can imagine that people in Haiti's Central Plateau are so grateful to have a job that they're not very likely to leave to go do something else. And as a result, we have under 20% annual attrition at our centers, which is 5 times less than you'll see in the traditional outsourcing world. Most of our customers at Samasource have been with us for over a year, because our quality actually exceeds that of traditional outsourcing companies, because we're able to get really bright, motivated young people from schools like Stanford and Harvard to come and work for us when they would never normally work for a traditional outsourcing firm. So we have this great talent advantage as well. And because we work from local centers that are controlled, and we put workers onto this tech platform, we actually know them and we can train them and monitor them at a pretty low cost, which means that our clients get the benefit of what we call a private crowd. So you're not just dealing with the free-for-all that you might be dealing with in a typical crowdsourcing platform. So there are all sorts of business benefits that we've seen with this model. And I'm proud to say that LinkedIn has been a supporter and a client of ours from the very beginning. We've actually completed 7 projects for your company over the course of the last 2 years. And we currently work with about 4 of your, I'm told, 200 or so data scientists, which means that there's a lot more opportunity to grow. I hope some of you are thinking about projects we could do together. So we've done things like make company names uniform. We've standardized job titles. We've looked up DUNS numbers. We've categorized universities. And we could do so much more. As I've mentioned, we could transcribe business cards. We could clean up the output of a CRM system. We could validate business contact information. So just think about what Microwork could do for your team. But even more powerful than the work that we could do with LinkedIn is the long-term alignment that I see between your company and ours. And this was just confirmed in the meeting I had with Jeff Weiner, where he was literally like, did you talk to somebody that I talked to? Because you are taking words from my mouth right now. This is what our operation looks like from a worker perspective. We recruit people from slums. and other poor areas who've participated in some kind of a local training program. So a life skills training or some kind of a workforce development program, sort of like what Larkin Street does in San Francisco with homeless youth. So just prepares them for the workforce. And then these workers enter our delivery centers where they train for about 30 to 45 days. Doing project-specific training, so we give them lots of sample tasks, so they get accustomed to the platform and the type of work we do, and they get English immersion on the Sama Hub. And what's remarkable is that a lot of these tasks, even without explicitly teaching English, naturally boost a worker's English proficiency because they're doing data mining on the English language web. So after 45 days of doing this work, they're much, much better than they were coming in, and they're able to do paid projects. And after that, they earn at least $5 and generally around $10 a day, which is, as I've mentioned, well above the living wage in all of the places that we work and multiple times what they would make doing any kind of local informal labor. And the really exciting thing is that after working with Samasource for 2 years, workers' employment potential is dramatically improved, right? Because they now have formal work experience, they now have all of these job skills, they have professional references from us, and they have a wage earning history that's verifiable. So they're no longer invisible on the job market. And one of my ideas is to take the reputation that they earn on the Sama Hub, because we track the throughput of the workers and we track their quality. You can see in the top right there, there's a point value and a quality score. Well, what if we could port that over directly into LinkedIn? What if we could have some sort of a badge, like a Sama certified badge, when a worker has reached a certain threshold in our system? That would be incredible. They could get started in the professional workforce with something to their name. And we could do the same thing with our quality score. So I think there's so much that we could do together to make the Samasource workforce more visible in the formal sector. And we could really use this method to build a long-term path out of poverty for millions of people. We're quite small now, but we've seen such incredible growth over the last year. And now that we have this technology platform built, we expect to get to 10 or 30 times our size in the next couple of years. I think that together we can, and pardon my horrible use of your "in," but I've noticed this all over your campus. So yeah, sure, we'll do some rebranding on a project together. But you know, I really think we could do so much to help facilitate the global meritocracy that I know all of you are so excited about forming. This is you know, the core of your company, is making it possible for people who work hard and have skills to get recognized for that professionally. So people who draw the wrong ticket in the birth lottery, like you imagined was the case for you a couple minutes ago, imagine what the world would be like if those people who drew the wrong ticket could still have an opportunity. We could make adding a LinkedIn profile part of the sign-up and registration process for new workers on our hub. So potentially even workers who don't end up getting into one of our delivery centers could still set up a LinkedIn profile and start learning about professional networking and the benefits of being visible to formal employers. So we have an idea to build an app with your engineers to showcase a worker's reputation, which I've mentioned. Another idea we had is to engage LinkedIn volunteers on an interesting platform that we're building now, which would allow you to correct and give feedback to our workers in real time on tasks. So imagine if you had an hour free per month to volunteer. What could you do with an hour? Not much. You know, if it's not online, you're unlikely to be able to get in your car and drive somewhere and do something productive and come back in an hour. However, if you could log into a system and have 10 tasks to do some quality assurance on that are pretty simple, right? Like the data mining tasks I mentioned, or maybe something around labeling an image, and you could actually give feedback to a worker who's done the task and see that worker's picture and see their profile and know who you're helping. And what's more than that, you could know how much you're increasing their income. Right? So you could know that because of me, this person earned several more dollars today. Imagine how empowering that might feel as a volunteer, and how quickly that could scale at a company of your size. So that's another idea that we have, is building this volunteer platform. We've started it, but we could certainly use more help. I have 4 engineers right now. So I think I'm going to end with some stories. I'm sure you guys would like to know who has benefited from this work in the field. And I think it's important for you to know that these contracts from your company, from LinkedIn, have benefited people who were previously written off entirely by formal employers. People like Shaleen, I met her about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago in Haiti, who is supporting I kid you not, 8 people with the income that she earns from Samasource. She was part of our class of 50 workers who joined in this town called Mirabelais, which is about an hour and a half outside of Port-au-Prince. And we started this center after the earthquake last year. So Shalene supports these 8 family members, and she's saving money to go to school to become a nurse, which would never be possible if it weren't for this kind of work. People like Neha, this is a direct quote from a video that I took about a month ago. It probably makes more sense if you understand Indian phrasing. But Neha's from a conservative Muslim family in India. And I met her in this town called Mehtia Bruce, which is a small district of Calcutta, a major city in India. And Mehtia Bruce is an all-Muslim neighborhood. And girls, women between 18 and 30 in this neighborhood have very few, if any, employment prospects. They're basically not supposed to leave their home unless they're teachers, so they're not allowed to work outside the home. But Neha and about 65 other women joined together to start a Samasource center in this neighborhood, and they were the first women that they all knew who had formal employment outside the home. And what's more, they were working with computers. And you'd think that this kind of work, because it's basic data entry, would be boring, but Neha was like, no, it's so exciting, and I get to learn about the internet, and my friends called me an insect of computer because I just flutter around it so much. And she was so excited, and she's one of the workers who's doing work for this company. So it's just tremendously empowering. It's shifting social norms in places where people thought women would never get the right to work. And it's also helping people like Sam and Tony. These are 2 young men we met on a recent trip to Kenya who are from the slums of Nairobi. And Tony emailed us about a week and a half ago, emailed someone on Claire, our head of sales, Claire is right here, by the way, emailed someone on Claire's team to tell us that he paid his younger sister's school fees last term, which is something he never thought he'd be able to do as a young man in a city with 70% unemployment coming out of university. To date, we've paid out over $1.2 million in wages to over 1,500 people who are living in slums, rural villages, and even some people in refugee camps in the poorest parts of the world. And every cent of these wages comes from companies like yours, companies who pay us to do good work, who don't hire us for our social mission, although I think it's icing on the cake, but who hire us for the quality of the work that we can deliver. And they're alleviating poverty along the way. So imagine what it must feel like for someone like Shalene, or Neha, or Sam and Tony, who never had a formal job before, to receive work and a paycheck, to receive that dignity that we all felt with our first job. Imagine what it might be like for someone like Jacqueline, who, when we last spoke of her, was depressed, other than her fun landlady, in a rented room on the outskirts of Nairobi. Well, 6 months ago, Jacqueline's fate changed. She got up in the morning, put on her best shirt, boarded a matatu, spent 2 hours riding with chickens and goats and who knows what else, but landed at one of our centers in the middle of town, and managed that day to secure herself a job doing data entry at this center. And she knew that this center was required by Samasource to recruit only people who made less than $3 a day and people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so people who in Kenya include women and minority groups. And after some training and interviews, she started doing data entry work. And initially, she said that she didn't really understand the point of doing this data entry. She was converting PDFs into text files. And then she realized that she was doing this as part of a project for one of our nonprofit clients, Benetech, which is around the corner in Palo Alto. Benetech operates the largest online library for blind readers. It's called bookshare.org. And Jacqueline learned that she was digitizing books for blind people in America. And she said that was when she felt a huge transformation. So imagine this woman who lived on less than $2 a day feels proud that she's helping blind people in America. What a great story. And Jacqueline said that for the first time she feels, I just wanted to share this photo because I love it. she feels useful because she knows that there are all of these people who are depending on her work. And if she keys in a word wrong, somebody's going to hear that word wrong in the audio software that Benetech uses to power Bookshare. She supports her 3 younger sisters and her mom with this income. And she's saving money so she can go back to school and complete her engineering degree. But I think what's more powerful than all of this is that women like Jacqueline or Neha radiate this new sense of self-confidence when they start doing this work, because they know that they're going to enter the middle class, which is a really elusive designation in a lot of the countries in which we work. I think that work is at the core of human dignity. And for the first time in history, with the advent of mobile payments and cheap computing and cheap broadband and hardware, we have the power to extend the benefits of work that we all enjoy to the world's poorest people. But it's not going to happen by default. We need to really be intentional about using work to fight poverty, about recruiting and training people like Jacqueline, people who are the losers in the birth lottery, who are really taught from birth that they don't deserve to be part of the formal workforce. We need people like you to think critically about how you can use microwork in your supply chains, on your teams. We intend to grow this into a billion-dollar social movement that can lift millions of people out of poverty in the next decade and teach them that they can be producers rather than consumers, that they can be empowered workers rather than recipients of handouts, and that they can be part of this global meritocracy. So with that, I'll take your questions, and I will also leave our contact information up there so that you can reach out to us if you want to talk offline. Thank you so much.
So at 1,500 people, you're obviously just taking sort of the beginnings of this. And I found it interesting you also referred to the notion of this being a billion-dollar movement. Do you see the scaling of this as, I mean, how much of this is about what you do and as a company? How much of this is about what you inspire in others? And maybe sort of towards that end, what are the bottlenecks to getting those several orders of magnitude more people as part of this?
3 challenging questions in one, huh? So that's a great question, and I'm sure some of you have noticed the parallels to microfinance. How many people are familiar with microfinance, just by show of hands? Okay, so most, but because I can't see people on the screen, I'll explain what it is. So microfinance is the idea that you can give poor people very small loans and have them pay back the loans very frequently. And if you give them the loans without collateral, you can use all sorts of social dynamics to enforce repayment. And that with this model, you can empower people who would otherwise not have access to financial services. So this movement was started by a man named Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 and who I had the pleasure of meeting on Friday. He loved the Samasource model, I'm happy to say. And Yunus's idea was that, let's take these people who've been written off entirely as basically charity cases, and let's show that if we empower them a little bit, they can then go the rest of the way. They can form their own businesses and they can bring themselves out of poverty with these small loans. And the genius of Yunus's work was that he created this term microfinance that then got picked up and became a social movement completely outside of Grameen Bank, the organization that he originally founded. And microfinance now impacts probably hundreds of millions of people globally. His own institution impacts about 8.2 billion people in Bangladesh, but he's inspired this huge global movement. We now even have microfinance institutions that have IPO'd, like SKS Microfinance, that have received venture capital. So because of his initial movement in that direction, he inspired a generation of companies, for-profit and nonprofit alike, to move in that direction. And so when I talk about building a movement, that's really what I mean. I think this idea of microwork could be picked up by so many other organizations, right? If we could just shave off a teeny piece of that $1.3 trillion and put it in the hands of people like Neha and Shalene, that's where we'll see the impact. And to your second point about how we scale as an organization, because obviously we want to be a huge part of this billion-dollar social movement. The biggest bottleneck now, we have a couple bottlenecks. One is just scalable funding. So we're incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit, which is wonderful because it guards against any criticism that we might be a sweatshop or we might be incentivized to push down the wages of our workers. We have no financial incentive to do that. Like, I don't get paid, Claire doesn't get paid any more if our workers get paid less. So it does create a nice set of positive incentives for the organization to focus on the social mission. The downside is that raising money as a nonprofit happens in really small increments. So I spend almost all of my time when I'm not getting to speak at companies that actually work with us on a sales basis. I talk to donors, and a lot of donors don't get the idea, especially outside of Silicon Valley, that poor people might be able to do this work. So it's a bit of a long haul and a bit of a struggle to kind of move them in that direction and to raise the kind of money that we would need to scale the way that a company like this has scaled. And we're thinking about some solutions there. Any other questions?
My question is more around technological challenges that you face. You gave some examples of what people could do that could, I'll pick Card Munch as an example. What is the typical turnaround time that's expected of it? And a lot of these seem to involve images or PDFs that are going over the wire, and that we then get transcribed and then we get text back. So that requires a lot of bandwidth going down too. So how do you manage that?
So because we have these dedicated relationships with local delivery centers, we've been able to help them invest in their infrastructure. And once they start getting contracts from us, several of them have received financing to expand their centers, to get redundant internet and power. And we, in fact, now make that sort of a mandatory requirement for joining the Samasource network as a delivery center. So we do several real-time projects. We do an image labeling project, which is, I think, under a 5 or 10 minute turnaround time.
It's instant. It's
Oh.
under 3 minutes.
There we go. And we adhere to SLAs for real-time delivery of work, just like any other outsourcing company. And we found that the infrastructural challenges, sure, they're there. And if you walk across rural India, you're very unlikely to find very many centers that have redundant internet. But once you show that you can actually direct a stream of capital into that region, if you show an entrepreneur, look, you'll make your money back in 6 months. It's a very attractive proposition. It's a much better business model than any of the internet cafes that have been started in a lot of these areas, where people all make under $2 a day and can't afford to spend $1 an hour on the internet. But if you can bring in $4 or $5 an hour doing this kind of work, or even $3, and you can do that, you can run the workers in shifts of 4 hours each and have those computers use 16 or 20 hours a day. Imagine how much money that center that was previously bankrupt could make. And so with that capital, they're able to afford a lot of the infrastructure that otherwise might not be there. And we're seeing access to fiber optic cable in places like rural towns outside of Mombasa are now really close to this new fiber optic cable, so they have pretty fast download times there now. And we're seeing all sorts of infrastructure that we never thought would be in these regions.
So I have a question about coupling this with education, because work and education go hand in hand. In the case of Neha, she'll be able to do this data entry work, but over time she'll probably want to grow out of that, and she'll be capable of doing even more capable things. How would you integrate education to step her up the ladder and even become more enriching, both to her and her the people around her, as well as this effort you have?
I'm so glad you mentioned it, and I'm sure I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but I think the education model, especially in developing countries, is totally broken. The idea that poor people are going to be able to take 15 years out of their life to go and receive a formal education when the opportunity cost is like supporting your family, which earns less than $2 a day, it's just not viable, right? But if you have models that can combine work and education, or work and training, vocational training that can guarantee better job prospects at the end of it, you could really revolutionize the way that people get educated in these countries. And so one of our ideas with Samasource, because we now have this great platform for delivering micro work, is to deliver micro-educational tasks. So imagine, are you all familiar with Khan Academy? Have you guys heard of that? It's this amazing, oh, he was here. I love Khan Academy. I've relearned calculus thanks to Sal. But he's got this library of free video content. So what if we could embed Khan Academy videos on the Sama Hub and then ask some questions at the end of each video to gauge worker comprehension, and then get a foundation that's supporting educational initiatives to pay workers per task that they complete, per question that they answer correctly? What if you could break up the standard K-12 curriculum and deliver it in these micro units interspersed with real work? People could pay for their own education, or you could get all these foundations that are spending billions of dollars on schools that don't actually teach people, that measure success based on opening a school as opposed to the amount of stuff that kids are actually learning in that school. You could get all of that capital and start paying for actual outcomes, for consumption of this material that I think is going to be ubiquitous. So I think that there are all sorts of interesting things that we could do to intersperse these kind of learning opportunities with the Sama Hub. Another thing that we found is that after 2 years, we really want people to move out of the system or to move up within it. So we wouldn't want someone like Neha to be doing data entry for 2 years. She'd get bored, and she'd probably be really bad at it consequently. So we would want to move her into a QA role. And we've actually established levels on the Sama Hub so that workers can start with really basic stuff. They can start doing training, then they move into the most basic work, and then they slowly move up the value chain so they have a career path just like we have a career path. And at the end of that, maybe Neha decides to go out and start a center of her own and be an entrepreneur, or maybe she moves out of the system and gets a different job but has this great reputation behind her.
That's a great vision. Thank you.
Hi, I actually had a question about starting a local delivery center. Mm-hmm. So what's involved in that, and how do we do that?
So that's a great question, and we've been struggling with the ideal setup for one of these delivery centers. In fact, when Claire first joined our team, she joined to develop a franchise model for setting up these centers at scale. And so what happens now is we usually recruit entrepreneurs who've already established a business that uses the internet. So they have internet capacity, they meet all of our requirements around the number of computers they have and the power and all the other things they need to have to make a center functional. So they had an internet cafe or a small data entry center that was entering local government records or something like that. And then we show them the model, and then they adapt it, they adapt to it, and they start hiring workers from these disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's usually the model. It's a local entrepreneur who maybe has 5 to 10 computers, who starts taking on Samasource work and grows as a result of working with us. We have a couple of centers that are larger organizations that have, let's say, 150 computers in a bigger city and set up a separate unit just to hire Samasource workers. So they tend to be a little bit more sophisticated, but they've never hired people from slums before. And we say, here's a roster of organizations that you can hire from, and you're required to find people who are under $3 a day who meet our criteria. And we found that it's a new way of looking at business, even for companies in the developing world who would never think to hire from populations that are marginalized. We think that the cost of starting a center could be driven down to probably about $50K, maybe even less if we can get a deal going with Raspberry Pi. And we're running an event on November 4th. You all are invited. It's our annual gala. And we're going to be building something called the Sama Lab inside, which is like a test or a demo center. And we're building one of these in Kenya as well, where we're going to experiment with finding the lowest cost technology. Like, could we partner with a hardware manufacturer in China to get like the cheapest possible netbook that is able to do this work and that can survive any kind of conditions? Can we, pair that with wireless cards or some other kind of internet solution that could be the redundancy solution if they already have fiber? And all sorts of innovations that we've been thinking about in our heads but haven't been able to test in the field would go through this Sama Lab.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Monica, for supporting us.
So I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone in the room have one? All right, I have one. So first of all, thank you for being here. Secondly, how have you found the best way to recruit the workers? Like, how do you go find Sylvester out there who's a part of the militia and bring him in, so to speak?
Well, we're not rehabilitating them yet from militia groups, although I would love to have some kind of a program that would be like, give us your guns and we'll give you a job. That's for next year. But what we're doing now is we're partnering with community-based organizations. So there's this huge network of training organizations that's pretty well funded. There's a group called Don Bosco, which we've worked with, and they're all of these amazing technology training institutes all over the developing world who train people to use computers. So once they're done with Don Bosco, they know what a file menu is, and they understand the basic concepts of the internet, and they know how to do a Google search, but they don't have employment. And so we found that if we can just take people from these training institutes, they've already been trained, the cost of training has already been borne by that organization, maybe we can even pay them a recruiting fee to help subsidize that, and then we know what we're getting when they come into our platform. So we found that building relationships with these local recruiting channels is really helpful, and interestingly, the model that we have where we look to local entrepreneurs to source their workers is far more efficient than if we were to try to do that from San Francisco. So we've got this one entrepreneur, Steve. I love telling his story. Claire's met him. He's now like 28 or 29. I met him in 2008. He had 4 people working for him in this little dusty office in Nairobi. He's the guy who hired Jacqueline And since that day, he's hired 170 people to work in his center. He's become cash flow positive based on the contracts he's received with us. And he's figured out all these cool ways to recruit people as well as local hardware solutions. So he's got a $100 setup with a keyboard and a monitor and a mouse and a really old school computer, but it still does the work really well for $100. And he's built all these relationships with recruiters. And in Steve's case, he said he knew all of these recruiters who recruit for traditional companies in Nairobi. So they look at people who have a master's degree and who aren't from the population we're talking about. And he said that all of these recruiters had this whole roster of people from slums who they'd long been wanting to place as their sort of pro bono or their charity work, but no companies would take them because there's a lot of discrimination against the poor even within poor countries. And so when Steve went to these recruiters and said, I actually have to hire those people. I can't hire people who are not from poor backgrounds. They were just overjoyed. They were like, finally I have a place to put these 100 people that have been sitting on the back burner here who can't get hired. And they do require a little bit more training and hand-holding in the early days. It's not as easy to work with somebody who's grown up in a very violent or poor slum as it would be to work with somebody who's grown up in a nice suburb of Nairobi. But we find that once they're in, and once they've been trained, they're incredibly loyal and hardworking people because they're just so grateful to have this opportunity. So those local partnerships are a really great way to find people.
Very cool. Well, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.